Hi everybody, welcome back to Between the Lines. My name is Julian, I'm an obsessive reader and news book collector, and welcome to my first weekly update in a few months. I told myself I was gonna do these maybe once a week. Probably not, but it ended up being pretty infrequent. This is why I call them my weekly-ish updates, and we're just gonna pretend like I do these every week and just roll with it. So today I just wanted to give you all a bit of an update on what I've been reading since the beginning of the year, what I've liked, maybe stuff that hasn't worked for me as well, and what I'm planning to read for the rest of this month. I know we're already well into February, but there's still enough time for me to read a handful of books for the remainder of the month, so I'm gonna talk about what I'm excited to read for the remainder of February 2022. So let's get into it. 2021 was probably the biggest year for me in terms of reading, and that's definitely because of BookTube. Making this channel, getting out there, learning about more books, more authors, and just more stories I'd never been exposed to before was something really rewarding and really pushed me to read as much as I can and to really engage in series that a lot of people are talking about and really excited about, specifically The Wheel of Time, where the show was coming out and it was so big and so much hype, so that's why I started reading that. And 2022, I want to be even bigger. My plan at the beginning of this year was to at least match, if not exceed, what I read last year. I think I read about 60 books, that being novels, audiobooks, and short stories, kind of equivalent to the length of a novel combined. But this year I'm pushing myself to read at least a book a week, that being a kind of print or ebook, and also reading an audiobook every week as well, and throwing in short stories in between each of those books, and also getting back into comics. Comics are something I used to be really into back when I was in school. I would go to the comic book store every week. I was specifically into a lot of the DC issues that were coming out at the time in the New 52 run, but there was a specific movie that came out a few years ago, I won't say exactly what it is, but it completely killed any interest I had in continuing reading stories about those characters, even though it featured possibly my favorite fictional character of all time. But I feel like the wound has healed, enough time has passed, and I just need to grow up. And there's so many comics out there that I've wanted to get into, and in discovering that the library has access to so many digital comics, like an insane amount, every single one that was on my wish list the library has, I'm really pushing myself to get back into comic books or graphic novels, whatever you want to call them, and I'm really throwing a lot of those into my TBR for this year, even though I didn't discuss them in my 2022 TBR. This was just kind of a spur of the moment thing that happened at the beginning of the year. Later on, I'll get into what specific comics I've been reading, but let's start off with just discussing some of the books I've read in January and the early parts of February that I really liked and enjoyed. Firstly, we have Seasons of Albaddon. This is a book that a lot of people in the BookTube community have been talking about and raved about, and I was very excited to get into it. It seemed like something I'd really enjoy. And I did. I really did enjoy this book. It was a series of sort of short stories, sort of novellas, 4 stories that each take place within a season within this land of Albaddon. And the stories, although they are distinct, kind of have intermingling characters and themes and locations. And I thought this book was honestly just beautiful, even though it was a short read and I went through it pretty quickly. There was so much packed into here, so much depth of character and emotion and world building, and I really liked how this book really focused on the perspective of ordinary people. It didn't really take your typical fantasy protagonists. It really just kind of centered on people living their everyday lives and the everyday problems that people in this world struggle with. So there was a lot there to relate to and a lot to empathize with, and this book was actually a lot more sad and had a lot more emotional punch than I was expecting. I thought it was going to be a pretty light read, but it actually really got to me, especially in a couple of the stories in there. And I liked how the stories were wrapped up enough that they had their own beginning and end, but open-ended enough that I'm curious to see more about this world if the authors choose to expand upon it in further books. Next, we have Fahrenheit 451, which was a big blind spot in my classics reading, and this was another one. Like, I've read some Ray Bradbury before and I've enjoyed it quite a bit, but this was his first novel that I've read, and this book kind of lives up to its reputation. It has a lot to talk about, a lot of discussion, specifically about things like media consumption and censorship, and of course having it being written years ago, decades ago, and predicting a lot of the media trends and technology that would maybe become more prominent in today's age was something really interesting to see, and I feel like I appreciated this book a lot for what it was not necessarily predicting, but just kind of revealing about humanity and the places we may go. And especially in a time like this when people are still burning books and doing crazy stuff like that, to kind of see the commentary about this that took place within the 20th century still applying it to now is frankly just, you know, crazy, and there was a lot to process with this book. After that, I read The Dragon Reborn, book 3 in the Wheel of Time, and I did a full review on this one that I talked about on the channel, so I won't get into too much detail here, but I enjoyed it. It wasn't my favorite of the Wheel of Time books. I think I enjoyed books 1 and 2 a bit more than I did this. I think this book had the most kind of inconsistent pace. It had decent character development, especially more for the side characters, but this one had some frustrating aspects to it that weren't necessarily in the first couple of books that kind of took it down a step for me. But I liked it regardless because it was a Wheel of Time book. Of course, it was super well made, and the books have such an amazing world that I'm super eager to discover more about, so I can't say it was a bad experience at all. After that, I read Rendezvous with Rama, which is a classic sci-fi novel that a lot of people know of. I've read some of Arthur C. Clarke before. I read 2001: A Space Odyssey and really liked that book because I love the movie so much. And what I really appreciate about Arthur C. Clarke, and I'm seeing that now that I've read more of his work, is how he blends the kind of everyday, mundane, scientific investigation and scientific method to these kind of crazy high-minded concepts, like in 2001 with kind of higher dimensional beings who are interacting with humans, and in this one encountering a spaceship that is entering the system and it being sort of a first contact story. It was a bit more low stakes and there wasn't the most amount of kind of action or tension in this one, but I really appreciate it because it felt like real people and real scientists just going about their jobs and encountering this super otherworldly and high-minded thing. Another impromptu thing that I added to my TBR this year that I wasn't necessarily planning was reading, or at least starting, the Spencer series by Robert B. Parker. These are the classic detective novels that started in the 70s, I believe, and span over 40 books. I don't plan on finishing this anytime soon within the next couple of years. It's just kind of like a long-term thing to read whenever I feel like it. And this is a series I began because I had heard Jim Butcher in an interview talk about the inspiration he took from the Spencer series into writing the Dresden Files. So of course, loving that series so much, I had to go where it took its inspiration from. And right now, this week, I am reading Bloody Rose, which is book 2 in the Banned series, the follow-up to Kings of the Wild, which I'm enjoying quite a bit. I think I'm liking it a bit more than Kings of the Wild. That's a book that I really enjoyed, don't get me wrong, but the things I really liked about it were the fun and entertaining aspects of it. I don't think it was necessarily the most deep character-wise or thematically or had the most compelling story, but I just had such a fun ride reading that first book, and I'm getting a lot of that same just pure enjoyment out of book 2. Although this one I think is a bit darker than the first, not to say it's a dark book, there's still plenty here that's hilarious and light and breezy, but I think the stakes feel maybe a little bit higher and a bit more dangerous, and there's a bit more complexity to the characters here. I've also kept up with my goal of reading 1 audiobook a week. I won't get into all of them that I've read so far, but a couple of standouts I wanted to mention were Wuthering Heights. I finally got around to reading that one. It wasn't necessarily for me. I didn't get the most enjoyment out of this one. I think I've liked other stories from that time period in that genre a bit more, and I thought that Wuthering Heights was going to have a bit more of the gothic kind of atmosphere that I was maybe expecting going into it, although it is a classic gothic story. So following up on that, I went to the source of the gothic genre, or contested source of the gothic genre, being the Castle of Otranto, which was super short and really quick, but I absolutely loved this story. It was so atmospheric, and I thought it was super rich and entertaining, even though it was written in the 1700s. And I got much more enjoyment and fulfillment out of this one than I think I did Wuthering Heights. Also, in my push to read more classic sci-fi, I've got into some H.G. Wells audiobooks. I started with War of the Worlds, and this past week I just wrapped up rereading The Time Machine. I had read it in print back in high school, and I really liked it, so I went back and listened to the audiobook. I definitely like The Time Machine more than I do War of the Worlds, although I can see how important that book is and how much it's lent to the alien invasion and kind of Martian tropes that we've seen in literature. I just thought War of the Worlds almost felt like a list of stuff happening. The narration was very just, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, without kind of feeling in the moment or really there with those characters. It felt kind of distant from the action, while the Time Machine felt very involved, and there was a lot of discovery in it, and the ideas and commentary it presented I thought were just so much more compelling. In terms of short stories, I've read a handful so far. I've gotten into some of the Robert A. Heinlein stories from The Past Through Tomorrow, and I've enjoyed his style so far. I'm gonna start reading one of his longer works, Orphans of the Sky, a bit later on, but I've liked the tone so far, and I think these stories are the ones that he wrote before he kind of strayed into the more contentious and controversial political angles that he got into later, and I'm enjoying these, but it's going to be interesting to see how his style evolved and changed into that as I go through more of his works. I've also read a handful of Stephen King short stories, which is nothing new for me, but I've enjoyed all of them, and that's to be expected. I love King. Now, comics. In terms of comics, what have I been reading? Well, I've read a handful of the Dresden Files comics. Now that I've caught up in the series and all the short stories and all that, the comics were kind of the last frontier for me to enter in the Dresden Files, and they're pretty good. I think they've gotten better the more I've read them. The first one was very kind of one-off and short and okay, but the last one I read, Warcry, was a bit more interesting and had a bit higher stakes and felt like it meshed more with the main series. I've also read a couple Spider-Man comics, Moon Knight as well. That's a character I've never really read much of, but because the new show is coming out on Disney Plus in the next couple months, I wanted to learn more about the character before getting into that. And last week I read a comic series called Ghost Tree, which was really good, about a man who returns to his home in Japan and discovers he can see ghosts. And it's not necessarily an action story. There's a bit of action and a bit of kind of horrific elements, but I wouldn't say it's action or horror. It's very rooted in humanity and emotion, and it's not the biggest stakes thing ever. It was just a pleasant and beautiful story that I enjoyed. So what am I reading for the rest of February? There's not a whole ton of time left in the month, but there's still a few books that I'm really excited to read. Once I finish Bloody Rose, I think I'm gonna go back and read the second book in the Spencer series. Just, you know, kind of a light, breezy read, another quick, cozy mystery that I can get through in a couple days. I just want to keep evolving that story and seeing where it goes. I don't think I'm gonna read the book after that right after, because they're similar in tone, but that's Farewell My Lovely by Raymond Chandler, another book in the Philip Marlowe detective series. And that being similar enough to the Spencer book, I might save that for later on in the month. I don't like reading things that are too similar back to back, or else I'll kind of get burnt out on that style or genre, so I'll save it for a little bit later. After that, I'm gonna read Escaping First Contact by T.S. Byer, which is an indie book that was written by somebody in the booktube community and has a really interesting hook that reminds me kind of the concept of Rendezvous with Rama, and a bit like the movie Event Horizon, which had an interesting hook as well. And because it's someone in the community, it's something I've been looking forward to for a while and maybe even talking about on the channel. And lastly, in the month of February, this might be pushed to the very last days of the month or the beginning of March, I'm gonna begin The Shadow Rising, book 4 in the Wheel of Time. My plan thus far has been to read one about once a month, maybe a month and a half. I usually need to come down off the high of the book I just read and read some other stuff, get distracted by other genres, and then work up that kind of need to read another Wheel of Time book, or else if I read two back to back, I might get burned out, especially considering the length of these novels, and I'm feeling that urge again to come back and read book 4. And I've heard book 4 may be the best in this series. This is something I've heard from a lot of people. It's been contested that book 4, or I think Knife of Dreams, is the best one. It's something that I'm super eager to get into, even though it's also the biggest book in the series, and maybe one of the biggest books I've ever read. So that's it. That's what I've been up to the last month and a bit. Not a crazy amount of books, but not a small amount either. I'm really pushing myself to read more, read from more genres and more authors and indie authors as well. Let me know if you've read any of the books I mentioned today, what your thoughts were, if you liked them, if you didn't like them, and what do you think about the books on my TBR for the rest of the month. Before you go, remember to do all the YouTube stuff like liking and subscribing. That always helps out and I really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for watching. Please remember to support your local library, and I'll see you next time.